According to the U.S. Department of State, there are about 1.5 million NGOs operating in the United States. The individual missions of NGOs tackle issues of women's rights, environmental sustainability, sex education, you name it. One such NGO is Search for Common Ground. Search for Common Ground, or SFCG for short, has one headquarters in Washington, D.C. and one in Brussels. Broadly speaking, SFCG serves to cultivate peaceful relationships by partnering with community members and envisioning solutions together. Their 30 locations are dispersed throughout Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, even the United States. Each office is dedicated to its own unique programming initiatives. With us this morning to discuss recent and upcoming programs is one of Search for Common Ground's offices. Which one? I'll give you a hint. This country has the fourth largest population of all the countries in the world. Not China, not India, not the United States, but Indonesia. Our guest this morning is a very close friend of mine. Brittney Melloy is the Princeton in Asia Fellow at Search for Common Ground, Indonesia. This August will mark her second year in the office as the Program Development Officer. Good morning, Brittney, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Rebecca.
So before we proceed with more serious questions, can you wish our listening audience good morning in Indonesian?
Yeah, sure. Selamat pagi.
Oh.
Thank you for humoring me.
I knew that. I would say that every morning, but no one ever asked me to. But that's fine, Brittney. Steal my thunder. It's all right.
All right, so let's speak a little bit about Search for Common Ground. Can you tell us about the mission of the organization as a whole?
Yeah, sure. So our main goal is to end violent conflict. We're basically trying to transform the way the world deals with conflict, away from adversarial approaches to more cooperative solutions. And we use the common ground approach, which is taking two sides that are across dividing lines and bringing them together to find shared interests so that they can find solutions that work for both sides.
Sounds simple when you say it that way, but I imagine it's not that simple when you're actually implementing.
Yeah.
So let's turn to the Indonesia office itself, which is where you are located. What's the composition of your office? Who do you work with? What is it like?
So our office, there are about 20 people right now in our Indonesia office. And the staff is primarily made up of local Indonesians from various backgrounds, and as well as myself and our boss, who is from our country director, who is from the UK. But yeah, that's our Indonesian staff. We have some people that have gone to Islamic boarding schools, which we also have a lot of projects in Islamic boarding schools, so it works really well.
Great. And you're specifically in the capital of Indonesia, is that right?
Yeah, Jakarta.
Jakarta. Okay. What is your role as the Program Development Officer in the office?
Yeah, well, I'm the Program Development Officer as well as the Princeton in Asia Fellow.
Yes.
So I'm on a fellowship through Princeton in Asia, which is a program that allows recent graduates to intern for a year with the possibility to extend for a second year in either a teaching fellowship, an NGO, or a business internship. And so I'm in this NGO.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the office, I get to work with all of our program staff to help develop all of our different projects. And I'm also the lead writer, so I help out with writing our proposals for new projects and also working on the reports for all of our projects. And I also help out in the field sometimes, as well as monitoring donor information so we can see what other opportunities for new funding are.
And you work with issues in Indonesia, of course. How much time have you spent in Indonesia itself in relation to your work?
Well, I've been based there for this whole past year. So I just actually came back for a short break to the U.S., and then I'll be heading for my second year, for the second year of my fellowship. But beforehand, I had also spent, outside of working for Search for Common Ground, a lot of time doing research in and out of college or for other programs studying Indonesian. So, yeah.
Right. And I think when people think of Indonesia, they oftentimes don't realize that it is the fourth most populous country in the world.
Yeah.
It has the largest Muslim population in the world.
Yeah.
It's a massive place comprised of many islands, peninsulas, and things like that. Can you tell us what are some of the main issues, having lived there for a time now and heading back there shortly, what are some of the main issues that face Indonesia today?
Well, I think for us, I think the issues that we're trying to address that my NGO is specifically working on, we do a lot of women's empowerment, counterterrorism, promoting issues, promoting tolerance and peace throughout the country. So that's for us the main issues that we're trying to address.
Great. And so maybe that's a great segue into some of the programs that you guys have kind of brought to life.
Yeah.
So share with us some of the biggest successes, maybe your personal favorite in terms of the programs that Search for Common Ground puts out there.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of my favorite projects that we just finished earlier this year, it was a project funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this project, the main goal was to counter radical messages in Indonesian Islamic boarding schools called pesantren in areas that are vulnerable to religious intolerance or extremist groups. And so through this project, we went into Islamic boarding schools throughout Indonesia, and we trained groups of students to make documentary films. And so through these films, and all the films had messages of peace and tolerance and diversity. And then after they created these films, we selected the top 10, and we put them together in a film festival and made a DVD. And you can even watch the films online on YouTube, on our YouTube page at Common Ground ID. And we had a big film festival, and then we took the film festival out on a road show and went to more schools throughout Indonesia, and we showed the films at these schools and then had discussions about the topics and the messages that they had. For example, one film that comes to my mind, it's called Satu Alamat, which means one address, and it's about in the city of Solo, where a church and a mosque share one address. They're right next to each other, and the film is about how the church and the mosque coincide peacefully together and work together, and they also share the same address, which is reflective of that relationship. So and these are all completely made by students, the ideas and the film. So it's really interesting.
Beautiful. And so once again, our listeners can check those out, some of the submissions. Also, I think you said the how-to video that you used to teach the students. And this is all on YouTube for if you search Common Ground ID, just for our listeners. Perfect. So that was your favorite program. What have been some of the other initiatives that you've seen come to the table and come to fruition during your time at Search for Common Ground?
Well, another interesting project that we have, we're working in Indonesian prisons, and we're working with training the prison staff so that they can facilitate conflict management training and life skills training for high-risk prisoners, especially convicted terrorists that are going to be released within the next few years. And our goal with this is mainly to reduce the number of high-risk prisoners that will be tempted to commit violent crimes again. But we're working on building the capacity of the prison staff to facilitate these trainings with the hopes that this disengagement program becomes institutionalized as a standard disengagement program within Indonesian prisons.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
How has that been well received by the community thus far? Do you feel like you guys have been breaking good ground with this?
Yeah, definitely. We have received a lot of good feedback from the prisoners themselves, mainly because I think it's part of the approach that we take, that we're not trying to, coming at them with, no, you can't believe this, or no, you can't join these groups, but we're helping them reintegrate into society and helping them come up with concrete action plans. And just changing the way that they think about solving problems and managing conflict. So.
Great. And when you say we, I know that the office has a lot of sort of reach and a lot of different subgroups in terms of the people who are out in the field versus the people who are in the office. Can you talk about who might be some of those who are going into the prisons to do some of the outreach there versus maybe what your role in the office, sort of where one picks up where the other begins?
Well, actually, so for each of our projects, there is one main officer for that project, and they do most of the, that officer goes in and works with the prisoners, and they've had a lot of experience in the past doing this as well. But that differs from my role in that I'm more in the office, and they report back to me, and then I put together the reports. I don't have as much time in the field as, say, my coworkers that do field work, and mainly because I'm not as qualified as they are to do it. The few times that I've joined in, say, on the road show, where some of my coworkers were speaking to the large crowds and like the audience in the schools. No matter how fluent my Indonesian gets, I can never be have much of an impact as they do. Which,
sure.
I mean, that mainly stems from some of them have gone to Islamic boarding schools, and some have had a lot of experience in different sectors. So.
Now, Brittney, having personally spent some time myself in the Muslim world, not in Malaysia, but in Indonesia, but in Afghanistan, and seeing actually documenting the work that some NGOs were doing in Afghanistan, I know that there can often be a mistrust of these Western organizations that makes it more difficult for the job to get done. Even if you have, local people working with the organization, they oftentimes know that the backing is coming from outside of their nation. Is that something that you guys have had to deal with much, and how does the organization try to counteract that initial mistrust?
Yeah, definitely. We definitely have encountered that. Actually, when we were first doing this program in Indonesian prisons, there were definitely some former convicted terrorists that were suspicious of our program, but we try to counter this by partnering with other local NGOs as well, and that's one way. And then also just building trust with the prisoners, and then they see, once we've been working with them, they see we're not necessarily out to get them, but to help them reintegrate into society afterwards.
So time, it sounds like, is just a part of it. One of the other, we had mentioned before some of the programs, and I was also very intrigued by the radio broadcasting initiatives that you guys had. Can you talk a little bit about who you worked with for those?
Oh, yeah. So that was actually another component of that, the project in Islamic boarding schools funded by the Dutch. So for that project, in those same schools that we train students to make documentary films, we also set up radio stations. And that the goal for these radio stations is to promote peace and tolerance in their communities. And they're just local community radio stations, and to counter messages to counter radical messages in areas where that are vulnerable to religious intolerance and extremism. And we created content in radio shows, talk shows, and radio dramas for these radio stations, and train the students to run the radio stations themselves.
I feel like between the film festival, the radio, it's really nice that you guys are reaching out to the youth, because I guess the hope is that as they get older, they carry with them these more positive ideas. That's great.
Yeah, definitely.
So something else that we had spoken about, and I also found very interesting, you mentioned the Dutch, the Dutch who funded these programs in the Islamic boarding schools, which I found, I didn't realize. I said, oh, that's so interesting that the Dutch are funding these, but it's taking place in Indonesia. So who tends to fund your projects, the projects for Search for Common Ground? How does that come to be?
Yeah, so I'd say most of our donors, we have a lot from the U.S., the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Bureau of Counterterrorism, as well as New Zealand Asia Security Fund. We have all different governments. And basically these governments will put out calls for proposals that range from really specific, a project involving maybe 2 workshops on peace building, or really broad, like a project on like countering terrorism in Indonesia or so forth. And then our office, our staff will meet and we'll discuss what we want to do for this project, and then I'll work with the program staff to create a proposal that we then submit to the donor. Mm-hmm. Or we create our own project. Let's say one of the a staff member has there's an issue that they really want to tackle, and they have a really good idea for our project. Then we'll meet and we'll develop their idea, and then I'll work to create a concept note or proposal that we then try to ship out and to our donors and try to find funding for it ourselves.
Exactly. Great. Thank you so much. So if our listeners want to learn more about Search for Common Ground and Search for Common Ground Indonesia specifically, where can they go, Brittney? For more information on our organization in general, you can go to sscg.org. That's our website, as well as our Twitter at SSCG, or our own Twitter for the Indonesian office is at SSCGID. You can also check out our Facebook and YouTube pages, especially to see those videos, which is Common Ground ID. Perfect.
And I'm definitely going to check those out. We've been talking to Brittney Melloy. She's a Princeton and Asia Fellow at Search for Common Ground Indonesia and a Program Development Officer with that NGO. Brittney, thank you so much, and thank you so much for the work that you're doing as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's been our pleasure on the Hofstra Morning Wake Up Call to have Brittney on board.